Hello, I'm Jonathan Mast, and welcome to this edition of the Sedgwick Podcast. Today, we're talking about getting back to basics for accommodations. I have three great subject matter experts who are all part of our workforce absence group, and that would include Sara Elder, Senior Vice President, Adam Morell, Assistant Vice President, and Bridget Caswell, Director of Product Compliance and Statutory Administration. So thank you, three amazing subject matter people, for being with me today. How is everyone?
Doing well, thanks.
We're doing well, thank you.
Great.
Fantastic. Well, Bridget, let's start with you and look at the kind of the big umbrella picture here. As we kick off the conversation, tell us, in a broader perspective, what about leave administration? What should our listeners know?
Yeah, paid family medical leave landscape, it's becoming much more complex. So employers are looking more to streamline their policies. And one of the ways they can do that is using a TPA, a third-party administrator, to assist with one place for those employees to report their leaves. They still might have to go to the state if they have that state plan, but at least everything else is in one place. There's also some talk in the industry of trying to make benefits the most generous to apply to every statutory state. So in that way, you take the best of all these state benefits and make one plan to cover them all. But as more statutory states are added, this is becoming way more complex. Another thought is maybe look to group some states together like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. There can be some commonalities there. Another example, Washington, California, Oregon. See if those benefits can be brought up to match each other, because it's just becoming more and more complex.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot to get our arms around. So as we move over and talk to or about accommodations specifically, Sara, when we think about accommodations, what are low to no cost options that are available? And then what about those that require an investment of time versus money? And then, finally, I know there's some other things that go into it, flexibility, job training. So a couple of questions there, but if you can give us some insight on that.
Sure. So I think first and foremost, it's worth mentioning that in connection with a law review article, someone once did research on instances where cost became a legitimate defense, an undue hardship defense in cases. And first and foremost, it doesn't come up very much. But what they ultimately determined is that cost is often not something that is going to succeed, because the EEOC and state agencies are going to look at a company in its totality and not really buy the argument that getting an assistive device or a particular ergonomic setup that might cost a certain amount of money presents undue hardship. Even if it does present undue hardship for that particular manager's budget, and they might be inclined then to say that presents undue hardship. So I think one takeaway is, first and foremost, it's important to, even when it is something that does have a value, you have to get a chair, you have to get a certain kind of desk, to not rely on the cost element to say no. Where you can say no is if the employee wants the Cadillac version and the Ford version would do just fine. The Ford version is perfectly acceptable, and if they want the Cadillac version, they can front the cost to get that difference, or to pay that difference. But so one thing to remember is, cost should not necessarily be a crutch to say no to an accommodation. And then to your point about considering other accommodations that don't have something quantifiable attached to them, those kinds of accommodations include like offering schedule flexibility that is often one that is hard for managers to stomach because they like predictability. And in many instances, reasonable and reliable and predictable attendance is an essential function of the job. You can imagine if you're on a manufacturing setting and you have to be on that assembly line or what have you, and that makes perfect sense. But where there are opportunities to look at are situations where that flexibility could extend to additional time for break periods, or something that might enable someone to continue working. If it could be temperature related, changing the temperature in the area so that they don't become overheated. The typical ones that include consideration of no cost rely on flexibility for scheduling and being open to that, because there are certain, particularly among the salaried population, jobs where flexibility makes sense. They can do certain things at night. They don't need to be on the phone to answer a call for a customer at a certain period of time. Other examples include mentioned breaks. Other low-cost accommodations could include changing the monitors, changing the lighting, if you can't change the lighting, putting a filter over a particular light that might help for someone who is suffering from migraines. And then oftentimes it could be just allowing permission for them to bring something in that they know works for them. It could be a fan, where maybe fans are typically allowed at the desk. And one that clients don't always like to hear about, but an emotional support animal, where there are some assurances that animal can conform to the appropriate behaviors in the workplace and not serve as a distraction. So those, are some examples that often emerge, and then in the cognitive area or in the job aid area, it could be having someone read something out verbally, or just changing the size of the font on something where that might help someone that's visually impaired, or providing a little bit more training in a different format that's going to help someone that has a disability that translates to learning, grasp the information in a more effective way. I hope that answered your question. And Adam, if you have any additional thoughts, feel free to chime in.
The one thing, I agree with everything you said, Sara, and I think that a word to the wise about using cost as your reasoning for not granting an accommodation, if you do that, you open up your books, your balance sheet, because you're then going to have to show, well, this is going to unduly burden our organization. Oh, really? Well, let's take a look at your resources and see if that is a reasonable conclusion. And I don't think any employer really wants to do that. So not only should it not be used as a crutch, I think from a business approach perspective and a reputational perspective as well, you don't want to subject yourself to that kind of scrutiny and request for subpoena of information, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah. But I do agree with, everything else that you mentioned. There's a lot of stuff out there that doesn't cost, a lot of money. And I think that just by having the conversation with the employee, you probably will get insight about what it is they want, and the vast majority of the time, it's probably not going to be expensive.
Go along with what you were just discussing. How do these options impact recovery and inclusion and employee engagement. Obviously, this is tremendously important to employers as well as to the importance to the injured worker.
Yeah, Jonathan, you started off the discussion today by saying that we are getting back to basics. And when I think about the basics of disability laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, state or local law, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, the basics of those acts and those laws rest on the premise that we want to do what we can to keep employees at work or to help them return to work as soon as possible. So you mentioned several things. You mentioned recovery, you mentioned inclusion, you mentioned engagement. And I think that when done properly, programs like this and adherence to the law can really contribute to all those things. Let's talk first about engagement. When an employee is at work, that leads to improved morale, but not just for the employee themselves, but for everyone around them. And the morale of coworkers, not the injured worker, not the person who has a health condition, but their coworkers. The morale of those folks is something we don't often think about, but if someone is absent from work, other people are going to have to assume those duties. And people get tired of doing other people's work. Some people don't even want to do their own work, right? So you've got somebody doing someone else's work, their morale is going to take a hit. Whereas if that employee stays at work, the coworkers, it's going to improve their morale. Now let's talk about the specific employee in question, right? I'm not a doctor, but I can tell you this. Studies have shown over and over again that employees heal faster when they're at work compared to when they're just sitting at home. I mean, they recover more quickly. And I think this makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, an employee is able to feel like they're still a part of something. And this is especially important if someone's job is a part of their identity. So you've got an employee who's going to heal quicker. And then with regard to engagement and retention, even for that matter, I still think about something that I heard at a webinar, the Disability Management Employer Coalition, DMEC. They did a presentation in 2021 that quoted a survey that said that 60%, that's 60% of employees say that if they had access to a good return to work or stay at work program, it would increase their loyalty to their employer. And even though that data is a year or two old, I think it still applies. And when you've got the tightest labor market in decades, that engagement and retention is really important. And which kind of leads me in another direction that you didn't ask about, which is about how it benefits the employer. So let's talk about that. When an employer is doing what they can to keep employees at work or return employees to work as soon as possible, there's going to be some cost reduction there. I mean, when an employee is working rather than just being on leave, you've got hard dollar costs that you're saving in the STD payments, the short-term disability payments that you're not making because the employee's at work and the time out of the office is reduced. And another way that you're saving money, maybe a little harder to quantify as an employer, is you've got the employee at work, so you don't have to spend the time, the money, the energy, the resources in recruiting new employees or retraining current employees, right? The costs of hiring, onboarding, etc. I tell you something, when you have that employee still working, it benefits the employee. So, I mean, if you think about it, at the end of the day, if you've got an employee who is continuing working, ideally still a full-time schedule, but even part-time, there's so many people that benefit. The employee benefits, the employee's family benefits, the coworkers benefit, the company benefits. Overall, it just makes a lot of sense, and you are getting dividends paid off. If you're doing it the right way, you've got dividends being paid off in recovery, in inclusion, and in engagement and morale.
Well, that sounds great. What about when managers are supporting an injured or disabled employee? Where does training and the use of the interactive dialogue come into play? I think that, especially that key point about the dialogue, is something that listeners may not be as familiar with.
Well, you know, you mentioned we're getting back to basics, right? Simply put, the interactive dialogue is the backbone of accommodation. So I want to talk about this with some detail. You know, I called it the interactive dialogue. Many call this the interactive process. But the reason I prefer the term dialogue is because it is a conversation. It's a collaboration between the employee and the employer to figure out, you know, what is the optimum way to keep that employee at work or return them safely. And, you know, like Jonathan, any good conversation, an employer should ask questions and they should listen. And oftentimes, especially if this is done correctly, this will lead to more questions. So let me just give you some of the questions that an employer should seek answers to during an interactive process. Well, first of all, I mean, you want to ascertain, you know, does the employee have a disability that the ADA requires coverage for? Or with the case of the pregnant workers, you know, Fairness Act, you know, the employee will, you know, indicate that, you know, that they're pregnant. And it is important to note that with the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, pregnancy and pregnancy-related conditions are covered and require accommodation, even when they don't rise to the level of a disability, which is what the ADA requires. So when we're talking the ADA, you're talking about the interactive dialogue. Are there limitations that result from the medical condition? And if so, what are those limitations? And then another thing, so if you've established that there's a medical condition and you've established that that medical condition has led to limitations, one thing you'll need to keep in mind when you interactively dialogue is what are the essential as opposed to non-essential functions of the employee's job. Think about, for example, let's say you have an employee whose job it is to sit at a front desk in a lobby of an office. And this employee's job is to greet clients. And this employee's job is to answer the phone. And this employee's job is to manage some of the vendors. And this employee's job is to maintain calendars. Well, this employee comes to you and says, I have a lifting restriction. For the next 2 weeks, I can't lift more than 50 pounds. most likely that's not going to be an essential function of that role. So you need to think about, is the limitation affecting an essential job function? And then if it is there a reasonable accommodation that the employer can provide which will allow the employee to do the essential functions of the job? And if so, what is that accommodation? So these are some of the questions that an employer will want to get answers to when they interactively dialogue. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just some of the things that you'll want to think about. And I know that there are some folks that really think in terms of a dollars and cents perspective, right? They understand that doing the right thing is a good thing, but they want to know, well, how is this going to have a positive impact from a pocketbook perspective? So what I want to do is, if I may, I want to go back to the beginnings of the ADA. Did you know, Jonathan, interactive process isn't even mentioned in the law of the ADA? The courts invented it as a way to guide employers through the interactive process. Now, the ADA was enacted in 1990, but in 2008, the ADA was amended, and the EEOC, in a guidance, included the term interactive process in the amendment. So here's the dollars and cents part of the discussion. If you look at where things stood in 2008, right before the amendments were enacted, disability discrimination was cited in 2008 in just over 20% of the EEO filings. 20% in 2008. And at the time, this placed it as the fourth most common allegation of employment discrimination behind race, sex, and age. That was in 2008. Fast forward 11 years to 2019. In 2019, for the first time in the history of the ADA, disability became the most often cited basis of discrimination over all the other ones I mentioned. In 11 years, that change took place. Disability charges rose from 20% of the EOC charges in 2008 to 33% of all charges in 11 short years. Now, I know I've given you a lot of percentages, but to put it in context, that's a 61% uptick in the frequency of allegations of disability discrimination. Now, this hockey stick, I use the term hockey stick. I'm not an economics person, but I think a hockey stick-like rise is when you have, a chart showing something and something precipitously increases, like a hockey stick. This hockey stick rise in charges took place immediately after the law focused the change to underscore the importance of the interactive dialogue in 2008. Coincidence? I think not. Now, Jonathan, you also asked about training. Here's a phenomenon that we see every day. It's the, hey, you're good at your job. Or maybe it's a situation of, hey, you've been here a while. Congratulations. You're now a people leader. This happens all the time. And here's the thing. Just because someone has demonstrated, technical expertise within their role, it does not mean that they have the skills to manage people. So I'm a big believer in training to help develop these skills. I mean, when someone becomes a people leader, they should immediately receive training in the interactive dialogue. And actually other things, quite frankly, just off the top of my head, they should receive training in leave law, employment law in general, harassment prevention, interviewing and selection, diversity, equity, and inclusion, just to name a few. See, these things don't come necessarily, they don't come naturally to folks. So training provides the tools that people leaders need to succeed.
Well, Adam, to answer your question, no, I didn't know that. So thank you for sharing. I would have missed that on the Jeopardy board, so I appreciate it. And let's jump back over to Sara here and talk about as industry leaders predict and share our working age population has a 50% likelihood of becoming disabled for at least a few months of their career. That's 50% of us. As the needs of our global workforce continue to change, Sara, how can employers keep employees healthy and productive? What can we do?
That's a great question. I think the BLA in 2021 had statistics that about 1 in 4 American workers was 55 or older, and it's anticipated that through 2030 that we're going to see a decline in participation rates for workers that are younger, and continue to see that increase in older workers. So it does become important to look at this issue from several different lenses. One, from a legal lens, we want to make sure everyone understands that aging in and of itself is not an impairment or a disability, and that you really need to look at it through the manifestations of growing old. And by addressing many of the conditions that correlate to getting older, you're probably going to solve for some other issues that come about in the ordinary course regardless of age. So that's one important call out, because we want to ensure there's not unconscious bias against those who are getting older and assumptions being made that's going to translate to the need for more accommodations or inabilities to perform essential job functions, because certainly companies don't want unconscious bias to translate into discriminatory action. So that is just an important call out, and you want to be careful of treating older workers from a perspective that could lead to a regarded as claim. Someone might look older or what have you, but they don't have any physical or cognitive impairments. But we want to avoid that something that they might need in the workplace leads to regarding them as disabled and to illegal conduct as a result of that. But with all of this being said, is you indicated, and as those stats that I cited indicate as well, we do have an aging workforce, and there is a need to get work done by leveraging workers of all ages. So it is important to consider what types of actions will help with addressing the needs of that aging workforce. So first, from a proactive standpoint, it is important for employers to examine their wellness benefits and to see that potential opportunities to ensure that those kinds of impairments that correlate to aging are taken into account. And this becomes more difficult as we have more of a remote environment. One, you may not be able to see or observe if there's a cognitive decline for someone who's working at home or what have you. So it does become important to look at wellness programs from the standpoint of creativity, and managers can do the same. What are we doing to perhaps inspire more physical activity? Are we encouraging breaks? Are we encouraging movement? Do we have programs within our company that provide resources when someone might need to talk to someone about certain conditions, certain crises, et cetera. So it's a time to really look at what you're offering from an EAP perspective and a wellness program perspective to make sure that it is in tune with the trends that you see with an aging workforce. Maybe those types of things that they're coming to terms with, if they're no longer able to drive, if they're becoming empty nesters, and that's going to lead to certain types of changes in their mental health. And so this can be anything from developing support groups to looking at your employee resource groups, where there could be some internal support that might lend itself to addressing those kinds of concerns and issues. And then it becomes very important, secondly, to really know your jobs and get in front of the kinds of things that should be considered for an aging population. And as I mentioned before, really almost those of any age, but become more aware of things like, is the flooring that we have comfortable and conducive to those who need to stand for a long time, and those who, because of aging, might be more likely to have physical issues or mobility impairments. Know your jobs in terms of what software resources are available in terms of offering things like the ability to change font size, expand the screen size, give amplifiers that might be able to be used to enhance the audio in telephone calls. Know when you have certain roles that might require certain kinds of shoes. Are you offering the right kinds of orthotics and that might be more conducive to the physical challenge that are more consistent with aging? What about the lighting that might improve visibility? And then what about the tools that you're using? Have you provided checklists that can be used to sort of minimize some of the critical thinking that might have to apply where things are more amenable to being able to really administer a task rather than have to use more cognitive reasoning to administer the task. And then does your training include things like captions? Are you considering your equipment needs for lifting equipment, motorized carts, those stair climbing hand trucks? And are you amenable to breaks where they might help where there more resting is needed? So it's getting in front of what the job demands are and how those line up with the kinds of trends that you see with an aging workforce, and getting in front of those to make modifications up front where you can, and then being prepared, as Adam mentioned, to train managers on how to think outside the box in terms of what to do. And I might add that the training is not only important for the managers, the training and the development of some acumen about self-help in the area of disabilities and being able to make accommodations is important for the employees themselves, making them aware of communicating, the need to communicate their needs, and the need to cooperate when efforts are being made to come to some sort of an adjustment, because very often, particularly in a day and age where clients or employers are using third-party administrators, or where we have remote work and some things might need to be done telephonically, a lot of folks are picking up their phones, so that the interactive dialogue becomes difficult to perfect and a lot of it's done through writing. But if you, through training, include awareness on all parties, old, young, in between, it leads to good conversation about what could enable an employee to continue working. And it's certainly no different for an aging employee, but, one example might be to get a culture where that employee feels comfortable saying, I'm becoming more hard of hearing. It might help. Can we explore something that could amplify the voice of the callers that are coming in, and creating that comfort level where they can have that dialogue and they have the awareness to know that they can initiate that dialogue as necessary if something's not observable. So I'll kind of pause there, Jonathan, make sure that I hit on the big things that you wanted to cover with that question.
No, you gave a lot of great points, and that kind of brings us, as we begin to close out, just bring the whole group back and give everyone an opportunity to talk about any trends that you're keeping an eye on when it comes to stay at work and return to work programs, something to leave people to think about that you guys are immersed in this. So I'll just open it up to all three of you.
Can I drop a statistic, Jonathan? I know I dropped a lot of statistics before, but I got one that's pretty compelling. So
you just drop all the statistics you want.
Okay. 66% of employees, we're going to round up and call it 66 and 2/3 to make it an equal 2/3 of 100%. 66% of employees think that their employer should support their mental health needs. Some context here. My dad worked for the same company for 42 years, from 1968 to 2010. Jonathan, never once did I hear him talk about his company's obligation to aid in his mental health. And, now that I think about it, he never even mentioned health benefits at all, with the exception of in 1982 when I had my appendectomy. That was really the only time he even mentioned health insurance. So, what a difference a generation makes. And when you've got 2/3 of employees believing that their employer has an obligation to aid in their mental health, I think that one thing employers really need to think about, Sara talked about breaks in the physical. If there's a physical impairment, if that person needs to rest, if that person needs to recuperate, one of the trends that we are seeing is additional breaks for mental health situations. My favorite data guy here at Sedgwick, Andy Berg, mentioned that at the onset of the pandemic, that anxiety really spiked. And I think that with the increase in the awareness of the importance of mental health, we're chipping away at the stigma of talking about it. There's still some there, but I think it's easier now. I think one thing employers need to think about is extended breaks or additional breaks for the mental health, for the cognitive impairment. And so the example that comes to mind is, presume you have somebody with, documented anxiety, and this person works in a call center, right? A call center environment, and they're talking to people and they're talking to customers all day. And look, I know how I am when I think I haven't gotten good customer service. And although I do try to be polite and kind in my daily life, sometimes my patience is tested on those customer service phone calls. And so what I could see is this employee who has the anxiety flare up when they deal with an unusually irate caller. Consider providing that employee what we call a just-in-time accommodation. So the employee has a flare-up of anxiety. Even if the employee has has medical documentation that says, hey, in these situations, the employee, should have off work the rest of the day. Well, you know what? Maybe asking the employee what they need in those situations might yield a result that's better for everybody. Maybe the employee doesn't need to take off the rest of the day. Maybe the employee just needs 15 minutes or 20 minutes in a quiet room to recover and get themselves, back up to where they feel like they can go back to their job. And that makes so much sense from a business perspective because the employee can let a coworker or a supervisor know, hey, you know what? I'm going to head off for 15 minutes, 20 minutes or whatever. And then the phone is covered while they're gone, and the employee then comes back when they're ready. I mean, if the employee gets in their car and drives home, they're probably not coming back. So in a situation where an employer is providing those additional breaks or those extended breaks, it could end up being less disruptive to the workplace, as well as providing all those benefits we talked about before if the employee stays on the job rather than going home. So long story short, although it's too late, extended breaks and additional breaks for just-in-time accommodations for the cognitive impairments, I think is a trend that we're seeing and hopefully will become more common.
Sara,
Jonathan,
Bridget?
one thing I might want to add is in the context of indefinite leave and leave accommodations that might indicate indefiniteness or the serial extension situation that might indicate indefiniteness. And this is an area that gives employers a lot of comfort because in general, with the exception of some, perhaps city human rights laws like New York City, for example, in general, there's agreement in the courts and in the agencies that indefinite leave is not a reasonable accommodation. And so oftentimes we see clients that are really anxious to get something characterized as an indefinite leave with a thought perhaps that might get them off the hook for making accommodations. And I think it becomes really important first and foremost to ensure that the paperwork that's being provided, the healthcare provider, and the conversations that are occurring with the employee, that's the issue of returning to work in some capacity first and foremost, and that is documented before characterizing something as an indefinite leave, because maybe the paperwork is written in a manner that might unwittingly invite a healthcare provider to put a long date out there or not really think outside of the box of how to keep that employee at work or return them to work with accommodations. And so it becomes too easy to rely on a lengthy date or the need for follow-up appointments to characterize it as indefinite. So that's issue number one and something that I often see. And then I think number two is to remember that even when a leave could be going beyond a point that's reasonable or could be characterized as indefinite, that indefiniteness doesn't mean that employee is not capable of performing some work that might be available within the corporation. And I often see this happening where employers forget about reassignment as an accommodation. And that becomes from a compliance standpoint, from an employee relations standpoint, and really from a smart business standpoint, because you've invested in these employees. And so it becomes more economical, if you just want to look at it from that as opposed to a relationship standpoint, to keep them in some capacity. So it's important to look for the job that they might be able to perform. And I would recommend that employees get in front of that and have a job bank of sorts, some jobs at the ready that often can be performed if someone in a workers' comp situation has met maximum medical improvement and can't do certain physical requirements or in other roles, but they could do something like, think in the retail situation, be a store greeter, which doesn't require much physical activity. Have those alternatives at the ready, because, at the worst, the employee might say, I don't want that position, but you've set yourself up well from a compliance standpoint, and certainly from a employee culture and company culture standpoint of saying, we care about you, and we want to focus on retaining you. And from an economic standpoint, it works as a way to protect the investment that you've made. So I think if I had to add anything, I just would again caution against trying to rely too heavily on that characterization of something as indefinite, and work a little harder to find a way to keep someone employed, even if it is a different position, reassign them to a position that's open. You don't have to create a position, but reassign them to something that they would be able to do.
Yeah, and I can add some of the trends that I'm seeing, are all the new state paid leaves. We've had the failure at the federal level to get that put across, so, the states are doing it themselves. This year we have Oregon. They are implementing 9/3/23. There's a possibility they could delay it, but so far they are on for 9/3. And then Colorado, 1/1/24. Not to be outdone, Maryland, Delaware, and Minnesota are all implementing 1/1/26, with Minnesota being the most recent kid on the block. Maryland delayed their 1/1/25 to 1/1/26 to join the group. And actually, Maine looks like they could potentially have their paid family medical leave passed in this legislative session. The date I saw for that was 5/1/26. So there's a lot going on in the leave space that definitely can affect what's going on with accommodations as well, if the employees in those states have the opportunity to take those state paid leaves.
Well, thanks to all three of you, Sara, Adam, Bridget. I mean, this was such great information. I hope that our listeners will take it to heart. It's a great resource to come back to. And of course, people can always find out more by visiting us at Sedgwick.com. So thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.